mess with the open. Usually I do this big announcery cold open where I tell people to hit subscribe, follow on their favorite, podcasting app, follow on their favorite YouTube. We actually follow on the only YouTube there is. And I ask them to write a nice review and hit thumbs up. I tell people they're listening to the Tom Kelly Show, where personal growth meets comedy. I'm a stand-up comedian who's going to be interviewing a stand-up comedian. And every week the podcast is about me sharing my journey, rebuilding my career, and the wacky adventures that happen along the way as I push for a quantum leap or breakthrough in my life. I do new episodes every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and I'm across the board as Tom Kelly Show on social media. And then I play my little...
The Tom Kelly Show! Everybody!
Yeah, see?
Tom Kelly Show!
And then podcasting from the Upper West Side of New York City, you're listening to episode 170 of the Tom Kelly Show. The man you heard me talking to just a second ago is a comedian friend of mine. And like a lot of my comedian friends, the friendship is long and not as deep as we would like them to be. I've performed, well, actually, we'll talk about the places I've performed with Jordon in a minute or two. But Jordon, I kind of know on a superficially deeper level in that, one, he's a funny comic. And I'll put a YouTube link or two to his stand-up in the show notes at podcast.tomkellyshow.com. But what was always more, or I don't want to, I'm going to say more interesting than the average comedian is, Jordon's brother, Russell, died in 2002. And Jordon's been very open about his experience with grief and how that's affected him. And frankly, has used his own grief to help others get through their grief. And he does that in his bi-weekly, we had that conversation last week, his now bi-weekly podcast, Where's the Grief? And I don't want to call it inappropriate, but it's definitely the most unique conversation I've ever heard about grief. It's not just talking to Pastor Rick about what's making you feel sad. It's real people talking about real loss. And as I do whenever I have a guest on the show, I start binging their work. And it's a podcast that, and let's face it, not to diminish Jordon's grief and not to diminish any of your own grief at home. We've all lost something at this point. If you're over 20, odds are you have at least one dead friend, or you've lost one thing that's important to you. And Jordon's tone with it is useful. And if this podcast is about taking life's lemons and making lemonade, and that's way too trite for what I'm talking about with Justin, but if it's about taking and experiencing the tough things that have happened to us and using those bad experiences to take us to the next level, Jordon's done a lot of that. And I guess, do you mind? I mean, is it wrong to start talking grief with a comedian friend?
I think that's how I start my show. My episodes, I dive right into the deep end. I mean, I always feel like the purpose of the show is to find ways to normalize that conversation so that we can talk about grief the same way we talk about everything else.
So I guess first, tell me about Russell.
So yeah, my brother Russell, he died at the age of 21. It'll be 20 years this summer, which is crazy to think about how long he's been gone. But he lived more in 21 years than most people I know live in a lifetime.
He sounds like a big personality from what I've heard.
So first of all, not only was he a huge personality, he was also a really small person to begin with. He had a growth hormone deficiency from birth, so he had to take shots to grow. When he was about 13 years old, he still looked like he was probably about 8 or 9. He was really small, but he was very street smart, really savvy, really charming, and would talk to people as though they were equals. Really was able to have adult conversations, I think, really early on. Very, very able to really read the room.
And were you older or younger?
I'm older. I'm 2 years old. I'm 3 years older, but we were only 2 years apart in school because of the way our birthdays fell. So we were very close.
Now, what made you start talking about grief in public?
6 months after Russell died, I started going to a self-help support group called the Compassionate Friends. And I found talking with other people that had gone through a similar experience very helpful. Peer support was, I think, one of the only things that was helpful because nobody had any answers. It was just a place to vent and talk and have my struggle acknowledged and not have my process judged. in any way.
And what your parents almost, I don't want to say forced, because by then you were in your 20s, but your parents pressured you to go, and what, you're still going to this group and they're not.
Well, so the way I describe it is my parents kept mentioning it. And so my goal was to go to this group, and it wouldn't be helpful at it, and I'd never have to go again.
Right.
And it's all these years later, and now I run it and they don't come.
So, but they'll go to your comedy shows, but not to your the grief events you run.
Right.
So I find with loss, like I have a friend of mine's mom, God bless her. She lost one of her sons. And the hard part with her is no matter what happens, whenever she goes to a funeral, it's not as big a loss as the loss she experienced. You'll be at a funeral, and it will be your actually, I remember one where one of our friends died, and the friend made it to, let's say, 43. And then her, she was kind of in the back going, well, at least he made it to 43. My son made it only to 19. Is when you talk about grief so openly, like I find I am shy about talking about my best friend dying or one of my good friends dying to someone like you, because you lost a brother. Like, is it competitive, the grief process,
First of all, this losing a sibling is one of the most overlooked losses. I find it's the focus is always on the parents, or if they were married, it's on the spouse or on their kids. The siblings are sort of left behind. There are more books out there on pet loss than there are on sibling loss.
Okay. Why?
So I don't know why. I mean, we're only about 100 years from a society where people had 8 or 9 kids and hoped that 3 or 4 of them would live. So maybe that's a part of it, that it was more prevalent. I'm not sure why, but I know that it seems to be overlooked. And because of that fact, I think siblings, when we, for me anyway, and in my experience talking to other people that have lost siblings, we're very sensitive to what's going on around us. We're hyper, at least for me, I find that my experience was very much focused on placating others before taking care of my own needs. There is no competition because we're already left out in the cold to begin with. I was constantly reminded over and over again that I was on my own in a lot of this. Even though I had my group and I had my parents were very supportive of whatever I wanted to do, I was still ultimately at the end of the day on my own in terms of how I wanted how to move forward. And it just didn't make sense to make a competition out of it. Like, I'm going through the worst thing to me. This is where the bar is set. So I can only compare it to other experiences in my life. I don't know. It's just not helpful to be like, well, my thing is worse. Like, says who?
So like, I feel like here's a weird one. So like right now, I get it, but I don't get it. Where I hate people who say my pet is like a child, right? But then I saw one friend who really loved their dog so much that changed my view on that. And this is a year right now where we're all going through some sort of loss. I lost my career and sense of normalcy when my work situation changed. Can the things you learn from losing a sibling apply to other types of loss?
I think 100%. I mean, I think loss is loss. That's the thing that I think is really important to remember, that we're all dealing with, when we're dealing with intense loss and intense grief, to each of us individually, it's the worst thing that there is. Like I said, we can only compare to other events in our own life, other feelings that we've experienced. I don't think you can compare to somebody else's experience per se. I share a quote a lot of times in one of my workshops that was written by C.S. Lewis. He wrote a book called A Grief Observed after the death of his wife. The analogy he made is pretty much exactly the same analogy that I made after the loss of my brother, and he had lost his wife, and they were just so parallel ideas. My idea was that it was like I lost a leg, and people were asking me why I was still limping, but his quote is quite beautiful. And it's the same thing. It's about losing a leg. And he says, to other people, that don't see it, when you lose a leg, I may get a prosthetic leg. I may have crutches, but I will have pain my whole life. I shall never be a biped again. And
Wow.
by the way, the pet thing, going back to the pet thing for a second, I had somebody on the show who talked about how, while it is true that our pets are not our children, to them, we are their parents.
Yeah, and listen, my friend that I'm talking about, God, I hope they're not, actually, I hope they are listening, because when their dog was old, and listen, I say this as a man who's taking care of 3 elderly people as they closed into the finish line. And they showed this dog as much, if not significantly more love than I showed my grandparents. No, and it sounds crazy, but yeah, they wiped that dog's butt every day. They carried that dog into the therapeutic pool.
Yeah.
And God bless. It's funny or it's not funny. It's strange. It's not even strange. It's new to watch them talk about their grief in public, because they have a new puppy, but they're still honoring the old puppy. And
Right.
and I thought that's just such a great analogy for things we're going through in life. Like, you'll never have a new brother. You may make new friends. I hope that some of the love that Russell had for you, has been filled in other aspects of your life.
I mean, I find that I'm really lucky in that the ways that I have moved forward have allowed me to continue to talk about him, to share his energy, his legacy, to, remind the world that he existed. And I feel really grateful that I have created that platform for myself to be able to do that.
Actually, do you do this for a living?
More or less. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you doing grief full time? That sounds weird, but I could see. No, but why, like you talked about, there's no book written. Why don't you write the book?
Well, I'm in the process of writing something. There are books out there. I mean, there are a couple of gold standards in terms of, sibling grief there, but there aren't many is what I mean.
Yeah.
There are some very good books on sibling grief, but there just aren't enough. Listen, I do my best not to judge anybody else's process or how they do their life. What works for you doesn't work for me. What works for me may not work for you. I think for me, it's really just about finding ways to acknowledge our different struggles. We don't have to compare, it's not a competition, but we can find ways to relate to each other on the commonalities.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, life is hard.
Yeah. So here we go. Here's where I think you could be useful to my listeners. We experience a loss. What's the first thing you should do when you're in a place of loss?
Well, first of all, I actually am against the idea of should. There is no should.
Okay. Yeah.
There's no should. I think that's one of the hardest parts about grief, is that we think there is a should. People tell you should do this, you should be doing that. There's an idea of how long you think it should take you to not be a total mess about it. I think it's hard to let go of the idea that this is a linear process, and that it has that there's a timeline to it. There isn't. It's not linear. It's.
I love what you just said there. That time limit. I know people who have experienced all sorts of losses, right? And there's probably a moment where you say, like, you want to say, hey, you experienced that loss blank years ago. You need to move forward. Toughen up, lady. Toughen up, buttercup. You're saying there is no time limit.
None. For somebody to insist that I need to get over it for them is not only insensitive, but it's like, why do I have that person in my life? What is that person bringing to my life?
And now here's the thing. I think there's a difference, and this is what I need to learn. And I'm going to sound judgmental, but I'm saying this as a question, but I'm going to say it with confidence, is where's the thin line between not getting over it and not getting off the sofa?
Interesting question. I don't know if there is I think the line changes, it moves, for me, I can go back to those couch days anytime I want, the self-loathing, the pity party that I threw for myself in the beginning is always there waiting for me if I want it.
Have you fallen back into that pit?
I mean, this year has been tough. Yeah. I've had certainly not nearly as far,
right,
as I was in the beginning, 20 years ago, but there are elements of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I think the biggest lesson that I impart all the time on my show and in my support group is the difficulty and the importance of finding ways to give yourself permission to do it the way that you do it. And more importantly, to have done it the way that you have done it, so that we can find ways to not beat ourselves up for not getting it right the first time or the 10th time. I mean, we're grasping at straws in the dark when it comes to grief. Nobody's really helpful. Like somebody like you saying like, listen, it's time for you to get off the couch and move forward, toughen up. That is supremely unhelpful.
I agree with that. What about to yourself though? I don't necessarily even say it to that other person, or anybody unnamed person who's experienced loss, who's on the sofa. Is there a point where they need to tell themselves to get off the sofa? Obviously, when they have other people depending on them, when they have rent to pay, and sometimes grief, I'm lucky I got a job. I'm lucky that, God forbid, I really did fall into the pit of depression. I'm hoping I could go back to my parents' house and hide there, something like that. Whether it be the loss of but when you experience loss, whether it be a deep loss or even just a relationship, it's funny, on one of your stand-up sets, you were talking about a breakup. That's a loss. I mean, maybe it's not as deep but it's a different kind of loss. How does a person, you as a grief counselor and as a podcaster and as a comedian, tell somebody, or maybe you don't tell somebody, how do you tell someone to tell themselves it's time to get up?
I mean, it's one of those things that I liken it. I liken so much of my grief process to my comedy career in a similar way. When we met, not long after Russell died, I was out in Times Square handing out flyers to strangers to try to come to a show. And people that don't want to come to a comedy show are not going to come to a comedy show, no matter who is on the show, no matter how great the show is. If they're not in a comedy mood, they're not coming to a comedy show. People have to come to a comedy show on their own terms. This has to be their idea. But nobody gets talked into going to a comedy show.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And so nobody gets talked into getting over a loss.
I think we have to deal with our own grief in our own way. It's unfortunate that we have to learn some of these lessons the hardest way possible. We are much better at giving advice than we are at taking it. I think we get in our own way a lot. We're really, going back to the should thing and the expectations that we set on ourselves. It's hard for us to get out of the self-judgment part of it. It's hard to find ways to incorporate these new facts and these new feelings into our ways moving forward. I think that it looks different for everybody. And I think because it looks different for everybody, that's why we're so hung up on the fact that we're doing it wrong, or other people tell us we should be doing it differently. It's taken me a lot of years to learn what works for me. I've often said that my process is trial and error, mostly error.
Okay. And what things work? I don't want to make this all about you and your grief, but what works for you on a low day to get you?
I started to lean into my grief a few years in, where when I would be having a bad day, instead of trying to suppress it or turn my day around in some other way, I would lean right into it. I would put something on that I knew that would make me sadder, and I'd let it wash over me completely. I'd really embrace it. And I've been really lucky that I have these, that I have a support group and that I have people that I can reach out to when I'm having a moment. There isn't anything to be fixed in a lot of these situations. There's a Megan Devine, who's a writer about grief. She wrote that some things cannot be fixed; they can only be carried.
Big ending, because I try to keep these down to 20 minutes, and right. I think there's a point in your life, and I feel like it was around the time I knew you, where you started taking your pain and giving it purpose. Were you always like that from the beginning, from when you started joining the group? Or was there a switch that made you say, I have something that will help people?
I think it was such a gradual process. I really think that for me, the switch was when I started doing the podcast, which has only been about 6 years. But it may have been visible to others in a more conceptual way before that. But I know that for myself, I decided when I feel like when I started the podcast is when I came out as a bereaved person. That's when I I felt like before that, my career, my comedy career and my grief were parallel, but they were separate. It was like living, two separate lives. And when I started doing the podcast, when I started to embrace this odd, total left turn from comedy into tragedy, is I think when I started to, realize that if I became a great comedian, I'd be just one more great comedian. I feel like my work in the grief realm is so much more necessary. And that it makes a bigger difference than just doing dick jokes.
Though what I love about your podcast is you do slip in a few dick jokes.
I do have dick jokes in there. And sometimes they're related to grief.
Notice how I use your podcast to get people to make sure they review my podcast on Apple Podcasts. I found this great review on the Where's the Grief podcast on Apple's podcast by Katin Bailey. And it says, I'm in the process of losing my dad, and this podcast has been a godsend. Listening to comics laugh and talk their way through their darkest moments has helped me navigate mine. When you hear a note like that, what goes through your head?
Well, it really makes me happy. I mean, when I first started doing the show, I didn't know really what I was doing, but I knew that I was getting a lot out of each episode, and the person I was interviewing was getting a lot out of each episode. And to me, that was enough to keep doing it. Everything else was gravy. The fact that other people really are listening is it blows my mind to know how impactful it is for other people. I say it at the end of my episodes every week. I'm really grateful that I'm not screaming into the void by myself.
Well, my friend, you have at least one more person in the void with you after binging your podcast today. And thank you for doing the work, my friend, and sharing it. Yeah.
I mean, like, listen, the thing that I say, the first joke the first real joke I wrote about my grief, it still remains true. And I think it's why I do a lot of this work. It's that it's so hard to find places where you can talk about this stuff. I tell people all the time, I go to a support group for bereaved siblings, and that's a great sentence that you can use if you ever need to get out of a conversation.
Actually, and you know what, not to go backward in the conversation for a second, but you used the phrase coming out as bereaved.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a bad comparison when you it's an important part of you. It may come up in your work. Do you need to come out as bereaved? And should more people come out as bereaved in casual conversation?
I don't know. I think everybody has to answer that for themselves. I mean, I think it's, I think it is one of those things that deepens you as a person, but I think that, it's not a defining thing either. Like, I'm not defined by having lost my brother. I'm defined by having had my brother. And because I get to, because I've come out as a bereaved person, I get to talk about my brother a lot. I talk more about my brother than I do about myself, probably.
Well, you all listen, let's pause on that, my friend. Next podcast, we're going to talk more about you working in the basement of Times Square together. And frankly, it is nice to have guys you are in the trenches with doing something beautiful with the things that put them in the trenches.
Well, I don't feel like I had much of a choice in a lot of this. It's sort of, I found my calling in the worst way possible.
Well, yeah. I wish I had a button on that one. I don't. And now that's a deflating thing. But actually, that's a stupid one for a minute here. Actually, that's the answer, or that's a question. There are other people who are coming out. Listen, my podcast is an interesting hodgepodge of people who I'm getting to know better in our secret Facebook group of super fans. All you have to do is ask me for the link, and you could be in the exclusive club that's deeper than my fan page. Just shoot me a note, TomKellyShow@me.com, and you can be in this secret group of friends, or Tom Kelly super stands, as I'm starting to say. And there's a lot of people going through something. And I guess, what do you say to people who are looking for that extra push to make their mess their message?
Wow, that is a great question. How do you make your mess your message? like I said before, we're so much better at giving advice than we are at taking it. I think that, there are no answers to a lot of this stuff. These are, the questions of, like, philosophy. Why are we here? These struggles, these definitely, you go through difficult, overcoming adversity is a story of triumph, of hope, of, pointing out that life throws a lot of shit at you, and life throws a lot of stuff at you, and a lot of it knocks you down, but we're capable of getting back up and trying again. And failure is information on how we can be better the next time. I think that is something that I try to apply across the board in my life, certainly in comedy.
I believe you. And I've seen it, and vice versa.
Right. So I think as long as we don't let the times that we get knocked down stop us from getting back up again, and being able to showcase how many times we've got knocked down as a way to show people, like, listen, look how many times I fell down before I, got back up. Showing people how your vulnerabilities can be used as a strength is a great way to not feel guilty or shame for having vulnerability in the first place.
And there you go, my friend. I think that's the button I was looking for the same interview. All right. So listen, folks, every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we have the Tom Kelly Show here. If you like this, and I think this is a particularly useful podcast, share it with a friend. If you want to find more about Jordon Ferber, they will be in the show notes. That it will be podcast.tomkellyshow.com. All that info will be there. And magic mirror time. You should do a magic mirror. Do you do the magic mirror at the end of your podcast? Oh yeah, there you go. This is where I shout out a few listeners off the top of my head. Shout out to Josh N, who's listening in Philly, and Diana, who just literally commented on my TikTok just as I was doing the magic mirror. Diana up in Canada, we see you. Until tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen, good night, New York.